the idea of this class is to try to help someone who maybe you're a good illustrator already, or something like that, and you just need to know, okay, how do I convert my skills? How do I change this so that I can actually create really good book covers? What things do I need to know? There's a lot of technical things that you need to know and understand. Especially if you're going to be doing stuff on the computer, how big do the files need to be? What kind of layout does it need to have? And all of that. So that's really the subject matter of what we're going to be discussing today. So just a few qualifications. I'm mostly a sculptor, okay? But I've done graphic design for something like 20 years, and I've done several book covers. Here are a few recent ones that I've done. I've done some of them for John Brown. I just finished one for Paul Janess. He's working on this project called Sakura. It's a book launch he's doing here, so I did that one. Now, when I say I did these books, I'm not an illustrator. I'm not a painter, okay? So I didn't paint any of these front covers. So what I do is I do book cover layout and design. And so titles, mastheads, laying it all out. And sometimes there's a lot that goes into that. For example, almost all of these paintings that I did the paintings that were done for John Brown weren't the right size. And so I had to actually, in some cases, paint whole sides and tops and everything so I can get it the right size. One of the most common mistakes that people make, I'll just bring up right now, is that they don't leave room for the title in the painting. And so that's something to be aware of. So many times when people come to me, I have to take that and I have to try to fix it if I can. And so anyway, so this is just some examples. And so we're going to go ahead and move on. So let's first talk about the purpose of book covers. Book covers are there to sell the book. They tell people, hey, don't judge a book by its cover, but everybody judges the book by its cover. It's pretty much the way it's done. So your purpose, first of all, is to attract attention and then qualify the buyer and then move them towards purchase. So attracting attention, you can do that through a lot of ways, bright colors, various things. But the biggest thing is you want to resonate with the audience, and that leads to qualifying the buyer. So qualifying the buyer means you actually want to push people away from the book that isn't going to like it. If your book has magic in it, and there's people out there that don't like magic, like fantasy and stuff. So if your book looks like it's science fiction, but it's really fantasy, that's going to cause lots and lots of problems. And so you actually, qualifying the buyer means they look at the book and they say, is this the kind of book I want to read? And so getting that right is really the essence of getting a good book cover, is figuring out how to attract the kind of people who are going to like your book, and move them towards the purchase. Okay, so the perfect book cover. This is just some things I've kind of built up over the years. There is no perfect book cover. Every choice you make about the subject matter, art, title, and design will attract one audience and alienate another, and that's okay. You can't make your book everything to everyone. You want to alienate readers that would not like your book just as much as you want to attract people that would love it. And the most perfect book cover is the cover that attracts the attention of your target audience and convinces them to buy the book. And sometimes people even find that a particular book cover, if my target audience is this giant circle, that I might make a certain book cover and it will attract this piece of that pie. And you might find that later, and many authors will do this, they'll reinvigorate the sales by their book by changing the book cover later, and by tweaking it, they'll sometimes hit a different segment of the market that maybe wouldn't have bought the book based on the book cover that was on it before, but will now buy it. Okay, so we're going to cover some different aspects of book covers, a lot of the technical requirements, and just everything you would need to know. So in the science, economics, and then the art, getting creative people. So the science of book cover. So I call it the science just because there's a lot of technical stuff that people kind of need to know. So you got to figure out how your book's going to get distributed first. Okay, there's you can do offset printing versus print on demand. Offset printing, for those who don't know, that's where you basically arrange to get your book printed in volume ahead of time, and then you sell them later through a distribution company or on your own. Print on demand, you got places like Kindle Direct Publishing. They used to be called CreateSpace, Lightning Source. We're going to cover in this parts of a book cover, your artwork size, margins, and finishes. So we'll go ahead and go through each of these topics separate. So your book considerations. If you're going to be doing ebooks, which is great, then we got Kindle, Nook, iBooks, Smashwords. There's lots of different ways to distribute. You can even just do plain PDFs. If you do that, you typically only need a front cover for your book. And so if you're going to do print, then you're going to need front, back, and spine. And if you're doing a hardcover with a jacket, you'll actually need the jacket flaps too. So we'll get into that in a little more detail later. Okay, let's see. So first thing, it actually does influence the design of a book cover, deciding where you're going to put it. Not only do you need to know how much to make, but like if you're just going to do the front cover or the spine or whatever, but if you kind of know that what the advantage and disadvantage of each, it can help you identify how your book cover needs to look. So offset or digital offset, the advantage to that is you can do large print runs, and I know some print runs where if you do a small trade paperback, if you can order 10,000 books, you can get it for as little as like $1.50, $2 a book. And so that's the biggest advantage. If you do a large print, then the cost per print becomes very low. And so it's a big upfront cost though, but you can end up with higher quality, and you can also do some really cool things like custom paper, coatings, embossing. You also tend to have more options with color matching. When you submit to print on demand, you're completely at the mercy of their printers, and they just print what they print. And so you have to like order a single copy on print on demand and see what it looks like. If it's too dark, you have to adjust your design, resubmit. With digital offset, the company, you'll actually go there and they'll show you a proof, and they can actually just tweak it right there. They'll tweak their printer for you. Print on demand won't do that. So typically print on demand, oddly enough, the dimensions don't matter. And what that means is that if your book's little or if your book's big, it doesn't really affect the cost too much on print on demand, but it does affect the cost the other. So, and as we'll discuss in just a second, the size that you make your book, it matters a lot when it comes to the design of the book. So, okay, I went too far. So print on demand providers, the big ones that I know of right now are Lightning Source, Ingram Spark, and Kindle Direct Publishing. They used to call that Create Space. So these are where they, you upload the design to them, and then every single time someone orders a book, they actually print it just for that person and then mail it out to them. So it's pretty cool. And like I said, the costs are a lot higher. Typically books are, depending on, it's really, the biggest factor that determines the expense of the book, how much it costs you to print it, is how long the book is. If it's a short book, it'll be very inexpensive. If it's a really long book, it'll be a lot more expensive. So KDP, Lightning Source, and Ingram Spark, those are probably the top providers. And by the way, if any of you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I'm more than happy to stop and answer any questions you guys might have. Okay, so parts of a book cover. Front cover, back cover, spine. So it seems pretty straightforward, but one of the things we're going to get talking about is, let's say, it doesn't really matter if you're an author or if you're an artist. Either way, you need to kind of understand how this stuff works, because if you're going to commission an artist, for example, to do your book cover, you need to give them exact specifications. You want to know ahead of time what the size of your book is. So does anybody know what's the best way of determining what size of book you should make your book? You actually just go to the bookstore and you find other books that are like yours, and you kind of see what it does. So, and if you're an artist and a author is coming to you and asking them to do a book cover, one of your first questions should be what are the physical dimensions of your book? Because if you're going to produce a file or a book cover or a layout or whatever, you need to know how big that document is, how big you need to make it. So anyways, you got your book cover. Now the spine, the bad thing about the spine is that usually when you're creating your book, a lot of times they're not finished with everything yet. They might be tidying some things up or whatever. So the spine, the measurement of the spine is completely dependent on the length of the book, and also the stock, the type of paper that they're actually going to use in their book, because the different paper has different thicknesses. So you just take the number of pages times the thickness of each individual page, and that'll give you a spine width. Places like on print-on-demand companies like Lightning Source or Kindle Direct Publishing, they'll actually have you go online, tell how many pages your book is. And when I say how many pages, I mean you want your book completely laid out in a program like InDesign or something like that so that you know exactly how many pages it is. And then you tell them this is how many pages it is, and then it'll say, okay, this is how thick your spine is. So and then the front cover and everything is just like if you're going to do a 5x8 book, then it's 5x8. Now, what these red bars are showing here is that when books, when they print your book, they have to cut it to size. They always print it a little bit bigger and they cut it down to size. And that's they call that a bleed. And the idea is that it allows your front cover to have color on the front page all the way to the edge of the book. Because the way they cut it and everything isn't exactly precise, it could actually have a little bit of wiggle room, like a 1/16 of an inch this way or that way. And so you've got to, in your design, you typically have to do, what's most common is an 1/8 inch bleed. So that means, and I think we're going to go on now to the next slide. You know, here are common sizes. Like I said earlier, pick a book size that resonates with your audience. So now, as an artist now, we got to figure out how big do we make this art file. We're going to set up our art file. And now you can use various programs to do it. Some people like to use Photoshop. I like Photoshop. I like doing book covers in Photoshop. Some people use Illustrator, and then there's InDesign. Does anybody know what the difference between Illustrator and InDesign is? Go ahead.
InDesign's more like internal layout, like you design your magazine or your book in InDesign.
Yeah. Basically, go ahead.
And Illustrator is a vector instead of Photoshop's raster.
That's right. Okay, so for those that don't know, so vector art is art that is basically a bunch of mathematical formulas. And so as a result, no matter how much you zoom into vector art or no matter how far you zoom out, it'll always look pristine and crystal clear because it basically is storing the mathematical formula for the shape of that. And so if you were to blow it up really big, it'll still be perfect. Whereas a raster image is an image that is cut into pixels. You've got these individual colored squares called pixels that collectively make up your image. So when you take a picture with your phone, that's raster. Most paintings are scanned in and are raster artwork, okay? So text, though, by default is going to be vector. And so the advantage of using Photoshop to lay out your artwork and to do any sort of custom special effects is very clear. So Photoshop's really good for that. However, when you're laying out text over top of it, if you're not careful and you don't get a high enough resolution, then your text could look pixelated. And you don't want your text to be pixelated. You want it to be crystal clear. So a lot of people will use a program like InDesign to do the layout. But you can just do the whole thing in Photoshop. You just got to make sure it's high enough resolution. So I'm going to just show you this real quick formula of how to figure out your artwork size. It's pretty easy. Now I have it at 0.25 inch bleed, but you can do 0.125 inch bleed. That's an 1/8 inch bleed. So if you want to know how big your art file is, so if you're an author, this is what you want to tell your illustrator or whoever, or if you're an illustrator yourself, this is how you want to set up your book. So to figure out the width of your artwork, what you're going to want to do is you're going to do your bleed, which is either a 1/4 inch or an 1/8 of an inch. Then you do your book width, plus your spine, plus your book width, plus another bleed, and then you times that by 600. 600 DPI is the minimum I would recommend mastering your book cover in. Now, does it really need to be 600 DPI? A lot of people can say, well, I can do it in 300 and it looks just fine. It's true, the artwork will probably look just fine in 300, but you might see that the edges of your text are just a little bit fuzzy, a little bit pixelated.
So if you go at 300 versus 600, what's the difference in price?
It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. If you just tell your artist friend, I want you to do it at 600 DPI, he shouldn't charge any extra for that. It's just going to mean that...
Why in printing? Is there a difference in printing?
No, there's no difference. So the only difference is the artist is going to have a little more powerful machine in order to do a big book cover in 600 DPI. So if they're an artist on a shoestring budget and their computer's like 10 years old, there's a possibility their machine might struggle with 600 DPI, but I don't know. It just depends on how complex their art files are. Here in a minute, if we've got time, I'll actually pull up the latest book cover I did, and I'll actually show you my layout of my Photoshop file. I'll show you how to do that. Any other questions so far? Okay. Okay, so here's an example of the latest one I did. This is a hardcover design. So you'll see here I've got there's my front of my book. There's my spine. You can tell by how thick it is. It's a long book. it's like 800 pages or something. So there's the front cover. There's the spine. There's the back cover, and then these are the flaps that wrap around the book. So you'll see. I don't know if you can faintly see, but this is actually a screenshot of the document. This isn't the exported image itself. It's a screenshot, and you can see in Photoshop I've gone through and I've set up guides, and those are to mark where the front, middle, and back, or the front, spine, and back cover are going to be. And then you'll see that it's probably too hard to see because I screenshot just a little bit bigger in my document, but this top line here is my cut mark. And then anything from here to the edge is actually the bleed. So your design has to have a little bit extra, and that way when they cut it down to size, it even if there's a little bit of shifting and wiggle room there, when it cuts it, your design will look good and it'll go all the way to the edge. So margins. The next thing I was going to talk about is margins. One of the things that it's kind of a pet peeve of mine is I'll actually see someone will do a really awesome painting, and then they'll start laying out their book cover. And when they lay out their book cover, they position content all the way to the edge. I mean, all the way. It's like right on the edge. And in some cases, it's so close to the edge that it's within the wiggle room that the cut mark might be a little off, and you could actually cut off some of your content. So if you go back here to this image, this is an image provided by Kindle Direct Publishing. There's a reason why they show a bleed going here, but they also could say going in there. And that's that you don't want to get content close to the edge. It looks bad, first of all. That's the biggest reason not to do it, is it looks bad. But the second thing is, anything in this red region is in danger of being cut off. And so you don't want to do that. So margins are important. So what you'll see when I lay out my book covers, there's a couple of things. One, if you're doing a soft cover book or a hardcover book, I guess it applies to either one, there's going to be a seam right here on this other side, because they crease a book so that when you open its front page, it creases naturally, and so the book doesn't just slam shut every time you open it. They crease it, they pre-crease it. And so that crease looks bad if it goes right over your title. So what you want to do, you always want to have, the crease is usually about 1/4 of an inch or so, maybe a little bit more away. So you want to have like 3/8 inch or something like that from the edge of your book, from the edge of your cover to where any sort of title element. So I won't invade any of that because, one, it just looks bad, but two, there's actually kind of a crease there. So as I said earlier, one of the biggest problems I see when people are designing book covers, they don't leave space for the title. In this particular instance, it was designed on this way on purpose because this is all about an android, and what's in her head is very valuable. And so we created a custom masthead for it and everything, and we purposely centered it over her forehead. And so even on my back flaps, the blue lines are the cut lines, and I've got healthy margins on the inside. You just don't want anything too close to the edge. Okay, so book cover finishes. This is important for the artist to know too, because you want to know how are they going to finish their book. Are they going to do glossy stock, or are they going to do a matte finish? Because glosses are the shiny ones, but shiny books leave fingerprints on them. And not everybody likes that, and not every design can handle it. Dark colors, for example, that are also shiny, sometimes those fingerprints can really show up. And so, and then matte finish are dull. That's more of a dull finish, but it's actually really pleasant to the touch. So the matte feel, people like to touch them and hold them. So what's the difference? Well, gloss will make your design darker. Okay, it'll make all the colors darker. And so you almost have to, so as a designer, if you know they're going to do gloss, when you're doing the illustration, if you're an illustrator, I would go ahead and just illustrate it the way you want it to look. But at the very end of the process, when you're getting your book cover ready to go, you're going to lighten it up if you know it's going to be gloss. Otherwise, it's just going to come out way too dark. So then the other option is matte, and in matte, it doesn't darken. It's actually pretty accurate to the color, but what matte will do, matte will technically, it'll actually kind of mute the colors just a little bit because the inks, the pigments will sink into the page. And so what you'll do to compensate for a matte finish is sometimes at the very end, you'll saturate it a little bit more, which means you'll just make the colors come out a little stronger than what you would normally think looks good on the screen. And if it's just a skosh more saturated, then you'll do that. So there's other things that you can do if you're going to do. These aren't typically offered in print on demand, but if you're going to be doing a bunch of like you're going to do offset printing, then you can do aqueous coatings, which is kind of like a semi-gloss, a UV coating, which is like really glossy. But what UV coating is used to do is to produce really cool effects where like you can actually do a UV coat mask where parts of your book cover, like strategic parts of the painting, are super glossy and shiny, and then other parts of the painting are not. And so you see these, like if you go to the New York Times best-selling list and you see what the big publishers are doing and putting out, best New York Times best-selling authors, you will see stuff like this: metallic inks, embossing, sometimes multiple. Like I remember when I was a kid, I'd buy a Terry Brooks book, and his front covers had embossing in it, like meaning that there was some 3D dimensionality to it. They would press a design into the cover, and then it was also they would do UV coats over the author's name, so the author's name was like really shiny. So you see a lot of this stuff in the more New York Times best-selling authors. Okay, let's go on to book cover budget. So there's lots of things that go into making a book cover, and it all depends on the style of book cover you're making. A lot of fantasy novels are illustrated, so a lot of it is just your illustrator and and then whoever's doing the layout. And if it's the same person, then great. I will say, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but an illustrator isn't always the best person to do your book cover layout. If your illustrator has experience doing design and layout, great, that's wonderful. But not all illustrators. Sometimes the illustrators take it for granted because they can paint like nobody's business, and they just think, oh, I can throw together a book cover real fast. But they're two completely separate skill sets. Okay, design and layout is completely different from illustration. So if he's got training, you want to see the book covers, and you want to ask people that know what. If you don't have a good eye for it yourself, you need to ask people that do to take a look and say, hey, I've got this great illustrator. He wants to do the layout too. Here's some book covers he's done. Does this look good? Anyways, that's good. But for other types of book covers, a lot of times nowadays, like I did a book cover for my wife's book, and we actually hired a model and everything. And so we got a photographer. Some people, especially for YA novels, they'll look to stock art, and that can be good too. But one problem with stock art is your cover ends up being very special, just like everybody else's. And sometimes you'll see lots of books using the same stock art on the cover, and that can be a problem. Another issue with stock art is that you have to read the license very carefully. Some of these stock art companies will, you're only allowed to use it so many times. Like you can only print so many copies before the royalty suddenly jumps up. So it may be only like $100 to download it or something and get a license, and you think, oh, that allows me to use this in perpetuity, but it doesn't. So take a look real careful on that. And then there's licensing that goes along with everything. And most of the time, nobody cares about this stuff unless you suddenly start selling hundreds of thousands of copies, and then suddenly you're going to be scrutinized, and people are going to say, well, did the model sign a model release? Is the fonts you're using in your book, even, or on the front cover, did you get those licensed? If there's any stock art, or even if there's props that were used in the photography and someone had custom made that, they'll ask for licenses. So it's best to just cover all your bases in the beginning. Another thing that we'll talk about is that cash versus barter. There are actually a lot of people out there that will just help you for free, or for trade or something like that. Like, I've made a couple of book covers for people, and the only thing I asked in return was a plate of hot, steamy chocolate chip cookies. I'm a sucker for that. So a lot of times you can trade, or some people maybe want to, like maybe there's an illustrator that wants to dabble in writing, and there's a writer that needs a book cover, and you guys are like, hey, I'll critique your book if you'll illustrate my novel. So there's lots of things like that. But when you do that, you should always get a release. And I actually own a software company. That's my day job. And so I work a lot with attorneys and lawyers and stuff. And on case law, you're actually a lot better paying something. If someone offers to do something for free, great. Have them sign an agreement and then pay them $1. And there's a reason why. If someone accepts money in exchange for goods and services, then it's not the court's business to decide if it was a good deal or not. But if you don't pay that person anything, then they can claim that they weren't compensated adequately, and later they can make a claim on you. And so it's best to just pay. If someone says, "Oh, I'll do that for you for free," say, "Great, sign this release, and I'll pay you $1." And you're 1,000 times better off if you do that. So just a bit of advice on that. Okay, stock art. The big ones I've seen: Shutterstock, iStock Photo, Getty Images. There's lots of other ones. There's a vector place. These are mostly for like photos and stuff, but there's a vector one called vectorstock.com, and that's really good for downloading things. Like I said, I am a layout, design and layout guy, not an illustrator. So when I designed the masthead for that Sakura book, I actually went to the stock art place, or to vectorstock.com, and I searched for a bunch of grunge, techno grunge, I think was the keyword I searched for, and I kept searching until I found a couple of pieces of stock art that later I merged and modified to make the masthead design for that book cover, and I purchased the rights to do all that. So okay, so enough talk about stock art. Custom photography. I will say that it's really tempting for people to believe that anybody with a camera can take photos, but that's totally not true. The kind of photos that you want to have on the front cover of a book should be professionally shot, and a lot of photography is all about lighting. So if a guy just shows up with a camera and says, "All right, let's take this picture," you should be nervous. It's all about lighting, so they should be setting up lighting and all kinds of stuff, and you get what you pay for with photography. But the nice thing about paying for your own photography is that if you get a release, you'll get a signed document from the photographer, and then it's yours. You completely own it. You can do whatever you want, and nobody else will ever have a book cover like yours unless they steal it. And then there's other options that you can take when that happens. We have some experience in that too.
I have a question.
Go ahead. If you don't have a release form from him that documents that he is giving you the rights to use that artwork in perpetuity, you absolutely can come back and say that conversation never happened.
But it has to say in perpetuity or something.
I would. That's what I would do if I were you. If the artist is willing to sign an agreement that says you can use this image for your book cover, posters, anything related to the book cover, all of that, that's great. What's even better is if he will give you exclusive rights to that image. But if he's giving you exclusive rights to that image, then that means he's never going to get a dime for that image in the future, which means he probably is going to charge you an amount that's commensurate with that, giving up those rights.
Do you have sample copies of these kind of contracts?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there's an app I downloaded a long time ago. I think it's still available. It's called Easy Release, that you can get on the App Store, and it handles all of this stuff for all of the types: model releases, photography releases, artwork releases, all of it. And it has sample contracts and everything. It's great. Last time when I did it, it was super cheap, and it just makes it really easy to cover your bases. Okay, so a model. This is a book cover I did for my wife's book. So she's local. I think she lives in Davis County. So how this came about is, my wife wanted this book cover, and she has this lady in her book, a Banshee, And we found this really interesting image, and we contacted the artist and said, hey, can we buy the rights to this image? And the artist says, I don't talk to normal people. He basically said, if you want to use my art, I've got a rights management company you have to talk to. So we talked to them, and they wanted to sell us that image for it was like $15,000-$20,000, and it only authorizes to print like 1,000 copies of it on a book, and then that was it. That was it. And then we had to go back and buy it again and all this other stuff. And we were just like, let's do it ourselves. So we ended up going a different route. We hired a professional photographer, and I went to a website called modelmayhem.com. So if any of you are familiar with that, it's kind of like a social network and advertising area for models. So I went to Model Mayhem and I searched around, and I tried finding someone that I thought had a really interesting look about their face. So that was, I wanted someone that I thought would be beautiful, but also, could potentially have a menacing look. And it was fun, and we came and we had a photo shoot, and half of the time, the models will just start goofing around and stuff, and that's good, because to tell you the truth, the shot we ended up going with was not what we had planned, and it was just one of her improvisational things. She just improvised. And it was great, and it worked out, and that's the shot we went with, and that's what it ended up looking like on a book cover, and it worked out great. Anybody have any questions about hiring a model? Just make sure you have the model sign and release when you're right there, when they're done. You pay her the money that for the photo shoot, and then you have her sign and release, and that way you own it, and she can never come back on you, even if your book becomes a New York Times best-selling book, and you're made millions of dollars. By the way, the original Star Wars movies, like Mark Hamill and Harrison Ford, they sold their likeness as part of their original contract in perpetuity to Lucasfilm. And so that's why whenever you see lunch pails and it doesn't even matter. I mean, you see Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill, and Carrie Fisher's likeness everywhere in Star Wars, and they only got the amount that they got paid in the first film, which was trinkets for it, because they signed away those rights in perpetuity. So, interesting. Okay, illustrators. So, where do you go to find an illustrator? I mean, I assume several people in this room can do it, so a conference like this is really awesome. You get a bunch of illustrators here. So, a lot of people here can do it. DeviantArt, CG Hub, Instagram is a great place. You can find stuff. Google search for images. There's all kinds of places you can use to find illustrators. Sometimes they're super expensive, and sometimes they're surprisingly affordable. And sometimes you might assume that just because some illustrator is this huge, well-known painter, that they're going to charge $1 million for you to do a painting. And sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes they'll do it for a few $100, and you're really surprised, or $600 or $800. Some of these guys are super fast, and they'll just do it, and they're just amazing at it. Any questions about this? Okay. Layout. So graphic designers. So once again, you got to find a guy who's got some skills at doing some layout. Like when I did this book for John Brown, all he had was this painting, and like I said, it was too long, and there were lots of problems with the artwork. He had hired it overseas, and the artist did a good job, but there were some problems. Like this guy's arm was only about this long. He had like a little pygmy arm there, and then this arm was also too short. Like the guy did not get everything. Like even her arm here, it's like he's trying to force the perspective, which is a comic book trick, they're trying to manipulate things like the lens is too close. He tried that, but it just didn't work that well. He did a decent job of foreshortening, but I had to go in and fix a lot of that, because it even bothered him. So I went and made this guy's arm quite a bit longer, and made this arm longer, and I had to move some of this up, and then I had to paint the whole top half of this, and I had to paint a bunch of this. And then I said, okay, what do you want to do for your back cover? And he's like, I don't know. And I'm like, well, how does solid black sound? And he's like, that doesn't sound very good at all. And I said, okay. So what I did is I grabbed the front cover and I put it on the back cover, and then I grabbed a high resolution image of some parchment, superimposed the two, blanked out all the figures, and called it good. And so because I wasn't going to custom paint something because I'm not a painter, but I was able to make it work. So this is a skilled designer can do that, And a good painter, if they had the inclination, could paint something custom on the back. But it ended up working out just fine. And we ended up doing, I think on all of his book covers, from that point on, for all of the in this series, even though we had a different book cover, we changed the color scheme on here to match, but we used the same image on all of the book covers in that series. And he actually liked it that way. Okay, so art releases and licensing, we talked about that. Okay, so towards the tail end of this, I'm just going to talk about some design principles here to try to help you guys tell the difference. Maybe help you recognize some good principles that would make a good book cover composition and stuff. So I'm going to cover some of these terms so that when you're talking to a designer or you're talking to an illustrator, or if you're an illustrator and you're trying to talk to an author and they say, well, I want you to do this, and then they tell you to do something that's completely messed up, then you can be like, you can start talking about, principles of design. Because one of the things, like we actually hired, in my company, I hired a few marketing graphic designers, and they were new. They were pretty new at it. They had degrees in marketing from a business school, and they started doing some layout and Photoshop, and they said, man, this is easy, I'm a pro. And so we hired them, we brought them on board, and we had them do their first couple of design pieces for some mailings that we were going to do and stuff, and they looked horrible. And so it was fine. So we just went to them because we expected to teach these people. So we sat them down and we started talking to them. And at first, one of the ladies that we had hired was very resistant. She was very defensive about all of her artwork that she had done, and she would say things like, "Well, this is your opinion, Art is subjective. Creativity is subjective. So anything you're telling me is just your opinion." And we had to say, no, that's actually not true. It's true. There's degrees of subjectivity in appraising artwork, but there are design principles that almost any good artwork is going to adhere to, and the artwork that doesn't adhere to those, the chances of it being good go way down. So it's kind of like rules of writing for those of you that are writers. Yes, you can break the rules, but you have to know the rules in order to break them properly. Otherwise, you're just showing that you're an amateur, right? So it's the same thing with art. There's a lot of rules and principles of design that can be used to help make your designs better. Do you have to follow all of them? No. Sometimes you can do things, but if you don't know the rules, then you won't realize when you're breaking them, and instead of it just being your own subjective creativity, you're just marking yourself as an amateur. So, okay, so that's design principles. So let's talk about a few of these. To preface all of this, especially if you're an illustrator, how do you decide what to do? Let's say an author comes to you and says, all right, I want you to do this book cover. Now what? You got to pick the scene. You got to figure out what to do. And I've seen lots of different approaches. I've had some illustrators where the author doesn't have any clue what they want, and so the illustrator will actually read the book. In some cases, they'll actually tell the author, as much as I would like to read your full book, but I don't really have time. So why don't you pick a few scenes that you think might be good, and then you can go in as an illustrator and read those sections and see if it sparks any ideas. When you're designing your book cover, there's things you have to consider. One of them is, what is the biggest thing you want to stand out in your book cover? If your name is Stephen King, it doesn't matter what your book cover looks like. All you need to make sure is that you leave room in the design for Stephen King. And if there's anything down here, that's bonus. It's gravy. Okay? So how famous is your author? If the author's name, if they're a big name, then you want to make their name big. And you'll have to adjust your design accordingly. Okay? If the author's big and famous and well known. So sometimes the biggest element you want is the author's name. That's typically, like if you're a newbie author and you've never done anything before, making your name this huge, like if you have an author that says, I want my name to be huge, and you're like, well, have you published before? And they're like, no, nobody knows who I am. And you're like, well, then that's probably not a good idea. So then you got to decide, well, what else? What else could it be? If your name isn't the one attracting it, then what else is it? Is it the title? And if you've really got a compelling title and your title is really going to help people identify with your book and say, okay, I want to buy this book, then make the title big. If not, then you're going to have to rely on the imagery. And so it all just depends on the nature of who you are, what you're trying to accomplish with your book. And so if someone asks you to do a book cover, you should be asked these kind of questions to decide what you want as your biggest element. If you're an unknown and you're writing a fantasy novel, you probably want some kick butt artwork. You know, that's probably the best thing you can do. And you want to make sure that's big and front and center, and you're probably going to want to minimize your art, your title and your titles and bylines and any of the matter that goes on the front. Okay, so composition. So I don't have a graphic to demonstrate composition, but I can tell you, I know there was a guy, he was a fairly famous fantasy artist. His name was Keith Parkinson. Anybody know Keith Parkinson? Okay, he died in like 2002 or 2003 or something. He got cancer and was taken long before his time, but he was an excellent fantasy artist. And he would do book covers, and the first thing he would do is he would get a piece of paper that had all these little squares, and he would draw these little black shapes on the square, in these squares, and he would make a bunch of these thumbnails until he found a shape that he liked, and then he would take that shape and develop a larger image. But basically when people use the word composition, what they're referring to is how you're using lights and darks, contrast shapes, all these different things to create a path that guides the eye to wherever you want it to look. When you make a book cover, especially if you're going to be publishing it on Amazon or some of these other places, those book covers get shrunk down pretty small. And if you're a potential reader, you're scanning over this, you've only got about 2 seconds to capture someone's attention. And so if you've got a book cover with good composition, you can make sure those 2 seconds count, because you can guide their eye exactly where you want it to go using lights and darknesses and contrast and all this other. And we'll go into more detail. So, but composition is just the overall, how it all flows. So one of the elements of composition is value. So value represents the lightness and darkness of the same color. And one of the ways you can see the values is by simply converting it to grayscale. You convert to grayscale, then this is a dark value, this is a light value. Now, when you see this image here, one of the ways that you can do this, when you're really far back, it might not work as well, but if you're up close, you can start squinting your eyes, and you can start, as your eyelashes start covering your eyes, that your vision will start to blur. And as that vision blurs, all the details go away, and what you're left with is where's your eye being drawn to, okay? So your eyes are going to be drawn to things with high contrast and are typically drawn to things that are big, okay? So when you see these areas at a really high level, her figure is a very strong compositional element, okay? Because there's lots of darkness in her figure, and there's light all around it, and that creates contrast, right? So she's big, and she's got contrast. So your eye is pulled here. Your eye doesn't get pulled up here because it's dark and there's not a lot of contrast going on. But this yellow background with the dark figure over top of it is a commanding presence in this scene. So that's composition. Now, if you want this to be a fantasy book cover, which he does, there's some smart decisions that John Brown made when talking to his artist friend, and that is this dagger. It's a very smart move for a fantasy book, because that's not just a dagger, that is a glowing light dagger, right? That's magic, okay? That's magic. And that communicates this is fantasy. The fact that what they're dressed in, you know, some maybe some medieval looking clothing, plus she's got that. This torch is another compositional element because it's got some contrast there. So it's pulling the eye a little bit, but this shows magic. So this communicates genre. I can tell by looking at this photo, this is a fantasy book cover because they're wearing medieval clothing and she's got a magic dagger. And she is part of this figure that is commanding the most attention. So right off the bat, this communicates, I'm a fantasy novel. If you like fantasy novels, I may be just the book you're looking for. Okay? So this is good. A good use of value. So hierarchy of contrast. So once again, I went into the same image. I upped the contrast on it to show you. The reason why I use the word hierarchy is because what you really want to do is guide the eye exactly where you want it to go. And to do that, you start with the highest contrast and you work your way down. And you can literally, when most people see this image, you can predict the order that they will look at things, because they'll typically look at things in order of its contrast and its size. And once again, you got to make sure the elements that you think will make your book sell the best are the ones that are emphasized. And we're just about out of time. Hierarchy of weight is probably the most important term that I use, because weight is the combination of size and contrast both. So for example, we were trying to decide how big to make John Brown versus Servant. Servant is huge. It's big letters, it's white on a dark background is the ultimate contrast. So we contrasted it heavily, and one of the reasons why is because John Brown was published through Tor Books, and then he republished this book on his own later, and he knew he was, not only did he have a name, but he knew this book was somewhat well known. So he wanted the title to be very big, and then we purposely subdued his name into the background by making it orange, which will have less of a contrast with the background color. So we wanted the name to be Servant, and then John Brown, and then maybe the Dark God Book one. We didn't want the series name to overshadow these others, so we made it smaller, and we put it across lighter areas so that it wouldn't have contrast. Subsequently, this was actually there was so little contrast here, it made it hard to read, so I actually had to go through and add some shadowing back there. Okay, and I think precision just refers to this idea that a lot of artists are really good at precision automatically, and what that means is that they'll put all the detail where they want you to look, and then they'll leave the rest of it relatively undetailed. And that's actually a good thing. It helps your eyes focus. One of the most famous fantasy artists, Frank Frazetta, did this quite naturally. So, hierarchy of precision. So, color, basically I'm saying there is you can use color to create mood and to attract people, right to your book cover by making bold, strong colors. But I think movement is something I'd like to get into more, but I think we're out of time. We probably need to close down. So it's a lot of information. Sorry if it felt rushed. If you guys have any questions, you can feel free to talk to me after class. Also, I'm more than willing to send you this presentation if you'd like. So just email me. My email address is devondorrity@gmail.com. So it's just the way my name is spelled right there. And follow me on Instagram too. You can see my artwork there. I mostly do bronze sculpture, so I brought a little teeny one just to show you. A little dragon head. All right, thank you guys.